On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take our final look at the ancient book of Enoch. And I want you to know that I've enjoyed looking at this book. It is really a fascinating read. It's in our December 2009 issue of Prophecy in the News magazine, the ancient book of Enoch. And Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the epistle of Enoch.
And J.R., it has been a great adventure to study the book of Enoch. Obviously, much spiritual truth comes down to us from the book of Enoch. Today we're going to begin in chapter 92, and I'm holding a copy of the book of Enoch here, which labels this the concluding section of the book. J.R., one word before we go on. We want to emphasize that we know that the book of Enoch is not Scripture in the same sense as the 66 books of the Bible. Nevertheless, it's profitable to study, particularly from the perspective of latter-day prophecy.
You can't get away from the fact that it was popular during the 1st and 2nd century.
That's right.
Most of the early church fathers, many of the churches had it read in the church services on Sunday. You know, it was public reading in the churches. And so it's really an interesting read. Now, there are certain sections of it that are not, shall we say, probably not original, that they are corrupted texts. In fact, we have one here. I just want to make mention of it. In chapter 106 and 107, we've got the birth of Noah. Well, I don't think that fits. Mm-hmm. It pretends to be by Enoch, but I don't think it is. I think somebody wrote it and it lay around. This is a collection of 7 ancient scrolls. This just happened to be one scroll that because it was about Enoch, it just got tossed in with the rest of the book of Enoch. But I don't think Enoch wrote it. I don't think there's any validity to that particular book. But I want you to know that what we're going to look at today is powerful. We've got in chapter 92 the whole history of the human race laid out in chapters 91 and 92 in 10, what is called here, weeks. And each day of the week is 100 years long. And each week is 700 years long. Therefore, the 10 weeks that we have here in these 2 chapters, we've got 7,000 years of human history. Well, Gary, there is no way in the world someone back in, let's say, even the 2nd century BC, in the days of the Maccabees, could have written such a thing because it's right on target.
As a matter of fact, as we look at it, we're going to discover that these 700-year periods are sort of like little parentheses, if you will, that mark out a specific developmental period in the history of mankind, and Enoch is right on the money. It's amazing.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. I want you to notice in chapter 92, he first says in verse 3, and the just one will arise from sleep. Now, Gary, this one is also recorded in chapter 91, verse 10, that the just one will arise from sleep. Now, this is a reference to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the just one. He is the just one. And yes, when he arises from sleep means that his blood was required, as we saw in Enoch 47:3, and now he has risen again. This doesn't mean in the end time. This, I think, refers back to his death, burial, and resurrection.
And he uses sleep here in exactly the same terminology of the Apostle Paul, when Paul says, for example, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, the twinkling of an eye. So sleep and waking here are death and resurrection.
Yes. Now, when we get to chapter 93, Enoch says, and Enoch commenced to relate the books and said, quote, I was born in the 7th in the 1st week, while judgment and justice were yet retarded. I was born in the 7th in the 1st week. Well, Gary, he was born 622 years after the creation of Adam, and that's in the last 100 year, or the last century of the first 7 centuries. So that tells us right then that the 1st week is 700 years long, and that he was born in the last day of that week.
And so here we have a way that we're not accustomed to looking at 7,000 years. Usually we mark them off as 7 periods of 1,000 years each.
Yes.
But it's amazing that Enoch had a different way. He took 700s and 10 of those to make 7,000. And it's interesting that we think of 7 as the number of completion. We think of 10 as the number of ordinal perfection. So when you take 700 times 10, you get 7,000. And that's the way Enoch has laid it out.
Yeah. You know, if he had been born 1,000 years after Adam, maybe he would have set it up in 7 1,000-year periods. But since he was born in the 7th century after Adam, he set it up in 10 700-year periods. And the very fact that he called them weeks also lends to Jewish theology in later times when the Lord set out the sabbatical cycle. So let's look at verse 4. There will arise after me in the 2nd week great evil, and destruction will spring up, and in it will be the first end, and in it a man will be saved, and after it finished injustice, after it is finished, injustice will grow, and he will make a law for the sinners. Now, Gary, this would take us from around 701 to 1400 years after creation. And the remarkable thing is what he has to say here about these things.
It's absolutely plain, because he says there's going to be what he calls the first end, which we look back on as the flood.
Yeah.
And a man will be saved. Well, that would be Noah and his family.
That's right. So, and the great evil that he talks about here would be the fallen angels that came down and corrupted mankind and caused God's judgment to have to fall upon the earth. So, in the 2nd week, great evil plagued mankind during the 2nd week, which was followed by Noah's flood in 1656 AM, or Anno Mundi. That is in 2348 BC. And after the flood, injustice will continue to grow. This allows for the Tower of Babel and the change of languages and the dispersion of the races. So far, he's right on target. He's gone 1,400 years. Now let's look at the 3rd week. That would be from around 1,400 to 2,100 years. During that time, Gary, he says, and let me read verse 5, and after that, in the 3rd week, in the end thereof, a man will be chosen as a plant of judgment and justice. And after him, the plant of justice will come forever. Who is that man chosen?
Well, in that time period, it can only be Abraham.
Right on target, isn't it?
Right on target. And here we come to, I think, something worth really discussing, and that is this phrase, a plant of justice. Now, we're talking about horticulture here, something that grows up out of the ground. What kind of a plant would be called a plant of justice?
Well, Gary, it's among the weeds of this world, you know. I mean, all of mankind is fallen. We are all sinners. There's not one righteous, no, not one. And in the midst of all of this, God is going to plant a chosen people. He's going to plant a seed of justice and judgment that will bring judgment upon the wicked. So in other words, they will lead the way for mankind.
Absolutely.
Well, we see that in Abraham and in the chosen people, his offspring.
We do, and as a matter of fact, it's fascinating, and we don't have time to follow it up, but Israel is the grapevine, traditionally. The house of David was symbolized by grapes, and in fact, the temple was decorated with that motif. And so the grapevine could be the plant of justice. The fig tree could be the plant of justice. The olive tree, symbolizing the Spirit of God, could be the plant of justice. But however you look at it, it's Israel.
Yeah. Abraham and his offspring.
Right.
That's what it says. So in verse 6, we come to the 4th week. He says, in the end thereof, visions of the holy and the just will be seen, and a law for all generations, and a court will be made for them. That's the 4th week. And Gary, that would take us from around 2,100 years after the creation of Adam to 2,800 years after the creation of Adam. And that puts us right in the time of Moses.
It does. Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt, and there's a court spoken of here. The court would be the events, I think, that took place around Mount Horeb in those days. The great marriage between God and Israel, the giving of the law, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Again, this verse says, in the fourth week, in the end thereof, visions of the holy, that would be God on Mount Sinai,
Mm-hmm.
and the just will be seen, and a law, that would be the Mosaic law, for all generations, and a court, that would be the tabernacle, made for them. It fits, Gary. So far, he's right on target
Mm-hmm.
here.
Absolutely.
Then we come to the fifth week. And after that, in the fifth week, in the end thereof, a house of glory and of supremacy will be built to eternity. Gary, this house of glory, this would be 2,800 years, 2801 to 3,500 years after creation.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the timing of that week, if each day represented 100 years. And we find during that time, Solomon built a temple in 2999 a.m. or Anno Mundi after creation. During this fifth week, it's right on target. A house of glory will be built.
The Temple of Solomon. And J.R., there has never been anything on earth like the Temple of Solomon, not even the Great Pyramid, because the Temple of Solomon was the place where God came and dwelt among men in a visible presence. In fact, his presence filled that temple to such a degree that the priests had difficulty doing their work. So what a house of glory.
Isn't that amazing? Now, Enoch here is talking about the specific things that will happen during these weeks of 700 years each. He doesn't have to explain the whole thing. He doesn't have to get into the details.
Mm-hmm.
He just has to give one main theme of each 700 years, and just to let us know that he knows what he's talking about.
Absolutely.
Because the important thing is what we're going to see in the last 3 weeks.
Yes.
Okay. So here we are. So far, we've got 5 weeks and Solomon's temple. Now, verse 8 says, and after that, in the 6th week, those who will exist in it will all be blinded in their hearts, and all will forget wisdom, and in it a man will ascend. And in the end thereof, the house of supremacy will burn with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root will be cut off. Gary, that fits the first century perfectly.
And these words are very likely written and recorded well before this period. We're talking about a genuine prophecy here. The people of the Hasmonean dynasty knew and preserved these words, and it was during the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty, it was during the rise of the Roman republics, the house of Herod. All of these things focused on our Lord's coming right at a specific moment in history, and this was it.
Yeah, and the first thing he says is the people are going to be blinded. That's Isaiah's prophecy.
Yes, it is.
Isaiah said that they will hear and will not understand, seeing they will see and not perceive. And Jesus said of his generation that they were the generation that were blinded. Blinded because they did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. So, it says here, those who will exist in it will all be blinded, and their hearts will forget wisdom, and in it a man will ascend. Gary, that's Jesus, who in Acts chapter 1 went back home to heaven, promising to come again someday.
Absolutely. And again, the shall we say, the long chance of getting this all right so far in advance, it reaches the point of impossibility. Enoch must have been inspired by the Spirit of the Lord. Again, even though we don't consider the book of Enoch divine writ on the same level as the 66 books, nevertheless, the Spirit of the Lord was in those words.
Yeah. It's like reading a great preacher's sermon, isn't it?
It is. Very much so.
And yet this one on prophecy is just incredible. Not only will a man ascend, that would be Jesus going back home to heaven, but the house of supremacy will burn with fire. Gary, that's the destruction of Herod's temple in AD 70.
It certainly is.
Burned. And then he says, the whole race of the chosen root will be cut off. The Jewish people were exiled to the slave markets of the world.
In the latter portion of this period, specifically AD 135, with the fall of Simon Bar Kokhba, the Jews were scattered all over the world. And J.R., this leads us directly into the next week, which I think is amazing, because the next week's prophecy is just astounding.
Yeah, the 7th week.
The 7th week.
And after that, in the 7th week, a rebellious generation will arise, and many will be their deeds, and their deeds will be rebellious. And in the end thereof, the chosen just of the everlasting plant of justice, that is the Jewish people, will be rewarded. 7 portions of learning are given to them concerning all his creatures. Now, Gary, that 6th week was up to AD 200. This one comes in at AD 201 to AD 900, and we have the exile of the chosen people, and we have the Gentile Christianity is corrupted by marrying the government of Rome.
And it's all right here.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is this plant of justice, that is the Jewish people, scattered around the world. It is said that when the Jews are in the land blossoms like the rose. The Jews become an agrarian people. When they're scattered all over the world, they become a marketing people, a technological people. When they return back home again, they become farmers. And once again, the land blossoms like a rose, and all of that is written into this prophecy. It's just amazing.
You know, he says that in the end, the chosen just of the everlasting plant of justice will be rewarded with 7 portions of learning. Now, here's what defines these 7 portions of learning. Verse 11, and who is there of all the children of man that is able to hear the voice of the Holy One and not tremble? And who is able to think his thoughts? And who that is able to see all the works of heaven? And how could one know the deeds of heaven? And be able to see his breath, his spirit, and be able to relate it, or ascend and see all their ends and think or act like them? And who is the man that is able to know what is the breadth and the length of the earth is? And to whom has the measure of them all been shown? Or is there a man who is able to know the length of heaven? And what is its height? And upon what it is established? And what is the measure as regards to the number of the stars, and where all the luminaries rest? Gary, all those questions deal with technology.
Yes, indeed.
The sciences. All the great inventors were Jewish.
Absolutely. From the time that they were scattered across the world until the present day, I might add, including their first return to the land, they have become known as the scientists. Albert Einstein, of course, being the most famous of our generation, but there are many, many others. You think of anything in physics, in chemistry, in architectural design, you name it, the Jews have done it.
In art.
In art.
In music.
Music. Literature. Think about the entertainment business. You know, the entertainment business, without Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, you know, Louis B. Mayer, and all the other Jewish people who went to Hollywood and set up that entertainment business, they were gifted, J.R. They are gifted. And Enoch says they have 7 portions of wisdom. So 7 divisions of wisdom.
In other words, the smartest people in the world are Jews. In every field of endeavor of technology, science, the arts, medicine, the Jews have been a blessing to mankind.
Oh, yes.
Never given credit. It was a Jew who invented the telephone, not Alexander Graham Bell.
That's right.
A Jew invented the telephone. I think it was in France. It was in Europe somewhere. And Alexander Graham Bell stole his invention. What can I say? I mean, you can go to the court records. The man sued Alexander Graham Bell and won. But Alexander Graham Bell had been written into You know, the Jews have been written out of history. They are persona non grata.
We could go on with this section for hours. Jonas Salk, the polio vaccine.
Yeah.
Just go down the list.
Oh, this 7th week is incredible. Now for the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th weeks, we go back to Enoch chapter 91, beginning in verse 12. And after that, there will be another week, the 8th, that of justice, and the sword will be given to it, that it may pass judgment. The sword, to me, Gary, was the sword of Islam. And we saw that they prevailed during those early centuries, but then they were defeated. You remember the Crusaders went to Jerusalem,
Yes.
defeated the Muslims. A couple hundred years later, of course, they drove the Crusaders out. But what we have here, and from AD 901 to 1600, a sword was to be given to the saints who will build a house for the great king. And this could refer to maybe the Protestant Reformation, because the Church of the Living God flourishes today and has for the past several hundred years now, since the Protestant Reformation. And so it could be, the European knights that went and
Sure, absolutely. And of course the battles of the sword in the Middle East around and following this period are legendary, between the Knights Templar and Islam and the Islamic wars that ranged all the way up into southern Europe. This would be that time, and Islam was defeated and driven back during that period. So again, he hits it right on the head.
Yeah. Now the 9th week, from 5601 to 6300 years after creation. Well, that takes us 200 years into the future from where we are right now. From 1601 to AD 2300, actually it takes us 300 years into the future. So here's what he says: the judgment of justice will be revealed to all the world, and all the impious will depart from the world. The judgment of justice refers to the Jewish people, the offspring of Abraham, who was the plant of justice. This could easily be fulfilled by the advent of the tribulation period, Battle of Armageddon, second coming of Christ to establish the Messianic kingdom.
Absolutely. And the judgment of justice here, to me, rings of the Great Tribulation. When the Lamb steps forward, opens the 7 seals, J.R., that's justice, that's judgment, because that's a sealed indictment. And when he opens those seals and the earth is judged, Israel is judged for her past sins, and in the process raised up into the kingdom, all of that happens during this period.
So when Jesus comes and establishes the kingdom, I want you to know righteousness will reign. Then comes the 10th week. That would be 6300 to the year 7000. And the Messianic kingdom should extend to the close of the 7,000 years. And Enoch says in the 7th part of the 10th week, that would be in the last century of the millennial kingdom. All right, 900 years in the future from today. This is what he says. He says that the watchers will be judged with a judgment to eternity. Now, Gary, this says to me that Satan will return. Listen to the beginning in verse 15. After this, in the 10th week, in the 7th part, there will be judgment to eternity, which is held over the watchers. Now, John says as much when he said at the close of the millennium, Satan will be loosed for a little season and will go out throughout the earth and bring another big battle against Jerusalem.
And there will be a time, as given in Revelation, when the devil and his angels will come into open battle with Michael and his angels, and Satan will be defeated, which is exactly what it says right here.
Yeah. And then he says in verse 16, and the first heaven will pass away, and seas and new heavens will appear. Well, Gary, at the close of the 7th millennium, John tells us in the book of Revelation that heaven and earth were passed away, and behold, new heavens and new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness.
Well, I have the Bible open right here. It's Revelation 21:1, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. In other words, there's a revolutionary change that takes place. Again, Enoch hits it. And think how long ago he wrote this.
Yeah. And then he concludes by saying, and after that there will be many weeks without number to eternity. In goodness and in justice and sin will not be mentioned from that time on to eternity. Wow. What an absolutely incredible thing to conclude this book of Enoch, to actually show us 7,000 years of human history and exactly what's going to happen after that. When you go to the book of Revelation, you see exactly the same thing written in different words, but it's the same thing Enoch wrote.
Well, J.R., we're coming rapidly to the end of our allotted time, and there are portions of this area of Enoch that are probably latter-day insertions, but when we get to Book 7, the final book by Enoch, chapter 108, we come to a conclusion that really puts a cap on the entire book of Enoch.
It does. It says, another book that Enoch wrote for his son Methuselah, for those who come after him, to keep the law in the last days. Ye who kept it, and now wait in those days, till those who did evil are completed, and the power of the transgressors has been completed. Wait till sin disappears, for their names will be erased from the books of the holy ones, and their seed will be destroyed to eternity. Gary, his first chapter opening this book is addressed to the people who live in the last generation,
That's
the
right.
tribulation period. He says basically, hello to all you people living in the tribulation period. And he concludes to these people saying, be patient, the wicked will be destroyed.
You know, that answers the question, how long, O Lord, which is asked all the way through the Bible, how long is it going to be before you come back and set things straight? And when you read the book of Enoch, you get a really, really broad perspective on that question, how long, O Lord?
Yeah. And it concludes by saying the sinners will cry and see them as they shine, and they will go there where days and times are written for them. Fascinating book, this book of Enoch. I hope you've enjoyed it, and it's just been a great read. If you don't know Christ as your personal Savior, you need to trust Him today. He alone can give you eternal life. He loves you. He died for you. Ask Him to forgive you and save you. I'm J.R. Church with Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.